Good morning, all you wonderful folks out there, or afternoon, or evening, whenever you happen to be watching this. You may be surprised to see me, Wayne Thusch, your board moderator here, instead of our illustrious Minister Patrick McCarty. As it turns out, Mr. McCarty has been heavily involved in the renovation of our Rose Cottage for the use of cots. And so he asked me for some time off for good behavior. And I said, sure, you've been behaving pretty well recently. And I'm going to give the message today instead of Patrick. Like Patrick sometimes cautions us at the beginning of some of his talks, we might find some of what I'm going to say a bit uncomfortable, and I think that's okay. Perhaps if we're a little uncomfortable, we might learn a little more, and we might change some of the habits that we really want to leave behind us. So today, I'm going to start with a short story. It's a story about a black mother who takes her young 5-year-old black son on an airplane for his first trip on an airplane. Now, this young man is very excited to be on the airplane, and he's looking around after they take off, and he's looking at all the passengers, and he says, "Look, Mommy, there's a man who looks just like Daddy." And she goes, "Oh," and she looks over, and she's about to ask him about that statement when he says, "I hope he doesn't rob the plane." She was astounded by that statement from her son. I hope he doesn't rob the plane, a man who looks just like Daddy. Well, she did look at the man again, and yes, he was black also, but he obviously looked nothing like his father. And so she turned to the young boy and she said, "Why did you say that?" And he thought about it, and he looked perplexed, and he finally said, "I don't know why I said that." Well, the troubling part of this exchange for the boy's mother was that not only was she a professor of psychology at Stanford University, but she was an expert on bias and how it affects what we think, say, and do. And she really expected more from her own son when it came to something having to do with the color of a person's skin. She was distraught to see that her son had apparently the same prejudices that others have who aren't of that same color. The story illustrates one aspect of implicit bias, whereby we all seem to take special attention to be taught about stereotypes. We get these stereotypes from our neighborhood, from our family, from our TV, from movies, from our church, from wherever. And in fact, I want to share with you something that our emeritus minister, Vivian Clark, asked me to do. She asked me to get this particular piece of sheet music and eventually play it at church. It hasn't been done yet, but the title of this piece is "You've Got to Be Carefully Taught." It was published in 1949 as a part of South Pacific, the musical from Rodgers and Hammerstein. And let me read to you just a couple of the words. You've got to be carefully taught to hate and fear. You've got to be taught from year to year. It's got to be drummed in your dear little ear. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be taught before it's too late, before you are 6 or 7 or 8, to hate all the people your relatives hate. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be carefully taught. Let me give you one more verse. You've got to be carefully taught to be afraid of people whose eyes are oddly made and people whose skin is a different shade. Turns out a lot of us have been carefully taught some of those precepts. This young boy on the plane somehow learned to determine that all black men look alike, even though he too is black, and that large black men can be equated with crime. He's not the only one. We are currently going through a tremendous social upheaval, at least partially caused by the implicit bias that some of our police officers have, both black and white, when they're encountering demonstrators on the street or when they're chasing after people who apparently have committed a crime. Unarmed black men and some women are being killed by police during these encounters in what sometimes are spur-of-the-moment decisions. And each of these tragedies, the police had to make that spur-of-the-moment decision on whether to use their guns to end a confrontation. And implicit bias often plays a big part in that split-second decision to use deadly force. While we may not want to admit it, all of us are biased. We have been taught, and we have accepted as truth, at least subconsciously, many stereotypes such as, real men don't cry. Well, that leaves Patrick and I out of that category. Another stereotype, women are weak, indecisive, and too emotional. And here's one for the Times, all politicians are crooks and liars. And if you are not successful, it's because you're not trying hard enough. And finally, black males are criminal and violent. There are so many other stereotypes that many of us have been taught and have accepted without even knowing that we have. But our being biased has nothing to do with whether or not we are racist. A dictionary definition of racism is a belief that race is the primary determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. By that definition, I can tell you categorically I am not a racist, but I can also categorically tell you that I am biased. We all have to admit that America was founded as a racist society in 1776. It's in our Constitution. Black males were able to be counted as 3/5 of a person for voting purposes, for representation in our Congress. And while slavery was officially ended by the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, our state-sponsored racism continued for an additional 100+ years because of the Jim Crow laws that were mostly followed only in the southern states, but not completely only in the southern states. So our officially sponsored racism continued in some form until 1964, 1965, and 1968 with the passage of 3 rights bills, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and the Fair Housing Act. So that's over 100 years of officially sponsored racism. I wish I could report that those official acts ended all racism and all bias, but we all know that's not what has happened. So, where do we go from here? How do we help to create a society that recognizes the worth of all people and gives all people the same opportunities that are outlined in our Declaration of Independence, our Constitution, our national anthem, and in our Pledge of Allegiance, which concludes with the statement, with liberty and justice for all. Well, now we have the Black Lives Matter movement that does not seem to be petering out like prior movements have. And that movement has gained tremendous support from peoples of all skin colors, and some police and politicians are actually taking a knee to protest police use of deadly force against people of color. And we even have a complete turnaround in one of our major sports, the NFL. You all may remember Colin Kaepernick of the San Francisco 49ers. He was castigated and actually removed from NFL participation because of his kneeling during the national anthem. People said he was disrespecting our flag, but of course, that is not what he was trying to do. What he was trying to do was to shine a light on the fact that too many black people are being killed by too many white police. He wanted to protest against the use of force killings of black people. Now, even the NFL commissioner wants some team to hire Kaepernick back, so progress is being made. I have been well educated and influenced by the mother on that plane. I told you about her earlier. Her name is Dr. Jennifer L. Eberhardt. She has authored an important book, which I've read, entitled Biased, B-I-A-S-E-D, subtitle, Uncovering the Hidden Prejudice That Shapes What We See, Think, and Do. I highly recommend both her book and her online video where she gives an outline of what's in the book. In her book, I learned that we are not, any of us, colorblind when it comes to the color of a person's skin. You may remember Stephen Colbert on the Stephen Colbert show. He was always saying, I don't see color. I'm wonderful. He was being comedic. He wasn't being truthful. I don't see color. Yes, you do. I see color. You see color. We all see a person's skin color. It's one of the first things that we happen to notice when we meet somebody new. So, I've also learned that we can admit to being biased without becoming a racist. Bias is not a trait, it is a state. Bias is not something we can cure, it is something we can manage. Dr. Eberhardt gives a prime example of managing bias in policing when the Oakland City Police Department tried a new tact. In the past, they always instructed their police to chase after an apparent criminal, and wherever that criminal went, even into some really dangerous situations or where a mob was forming, and to continue on. Well, they finally decided that that helped create too many officer injuries and too many officer-involved shootings, so they instituted a new policy. The policy was that when you start to encounter this sort of situation where you're chasing somebody and it looks like it's going to be dangerous either for other people or for the officer, stop, sit back, call for reinforcements, and wait for them to come. After they instituted that policy, the Oakland police found that their officer-involved shootings decreased dramatically. Before the policy was instituted, they had 8 to 9 officer-involved shootings per year over a 5-year period. That's about 40 officer-involved shootings over a 5-year period. And once they put the policy into effect, the officer-involved shootings fell to 8 over an entire 5-year period. That's a dramatic reduction in officer-involved shootings of 87.5%. That's truly amazing. By instituting this procedural change, individual police officers in Oakland were able to step back, slow down, and remove their own implicit bias from decisions about using deadly force. Wouldn't it be great if all police departments revised their procedures to create a reduction of police-involved shootings by 80-some-odd%? We'd all feel safer. I am encouraged to see that all the police reforms are being proposed and considered right now, and some of them have already been implemented by individual police departments. That should help lead us out of the current abyss into a more inclusive and safer society, one that truly does include liberty and justice for all. Dr. Eberhard indicates that racial bias and use of deadly force is not the fault of only a few bad apples. Bias is present at all levels of society, in media, in education, business, and certainly in law enforcement. The good news is that we are not doomed by our innate prejudices. She gives us sound advice on how we can all play a role in solving the effects of implicit bias. In closing, let me suggest that we do all have our own biases, and that's to be expected, and that's okay. Our job is to acknowledge them and to manage them in a way that does no harm to us or anyone else. Namaste.